We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
Who is that guy?
Who is that guy? It's this guy right here. So today's UX fail of the day. Are you all aware that when you silence your cell phones, you have not silenced all the sounds on your cell phones? And that if you set an alarm, the alarm will go off anyway and annoy everyone in the room? I did not find this out until fairly recently when I actually switched phones and discovered that my new phone operated that way. And then the whole family, of course, had to test this out. Turns out that all the cell phones these days operate this way, with the possible exception of Motorola. Anyway, I'm a UX guy, in case you can't tell, and I'm also sort of somehow, an Agile guy. And I've been doing the combination for running on towards 10 years now. My name's Hugh Beyer. I have been in the user experience, user-centered design world for too many years. Some of you may have read my book, which is called Contextual Design. Some of you may have heard about or used contextual inquiry, which was invented by my business partner of many years, Karen Holzblatt, and which we used for the past 20 years as part of our contextual design process. For the past 10 years, I've been working with 10, 14, what years anyway? About 10 years. I've been working with the integration of Agile and UX, starting in 2004 or so when we worked with Landesk and suddenly discovered that Agile and UX had a certain amount of, I won't call them irreconcilable differences, but certainly differences of opinion as to how to approach problems. Which was a very sad thing for me, because I actually started out like as an engineer way back in the 80s, working for DEC, doing databases. And when Agile came out, this was after many years in the wilderness doing RUP and FUP and OOP and all of these heavy processes, software development processes. And when Agile came along, it was like, oh my God, finally a process that somebody might actually want to do and it actually makes sense. And I, took to it like a duck to water. And it was a bit of a surprise when I went to Kai a year or two after I first encountered it and started saying to people, isn't this Agile stuff cool? And all the UX people look at me like, it isn't cool. It's a disaster. And I'm like, what? They're like, we used to know how to talk to engineers. We don't know how to talk to engineers anymore. So the last 10 years has been playing with why is that and how can we cure it? Because since I'm in love with both, it's like when your friends are arguing with each other and talking about getting a divorce. You don't really like that, right? You always want to get in there and fix it. The book that I wrote on, do we have copies in the room? I thought we had copies in the room. Do we have copies in the room?
I brought a couple for Ronald.
Yeah, look at that, great. Awesome. What's it called?
Contextual design.
Okay. The book I wrote is not that one, but it looks exactly the same, called User-Centered Agile Methods or something. Agile User-Centered Design. All right? Because there's this whole thing about how can you be agile and iterative and stepwise and also make big change in the world and have a real strong sense of innovation. Since then, that was in the fall, and at the time, I knew that In Context was coming to an end, at least in its form, but I wasn't sure what was next. Since then, I've joined a startup, and I'm working in an Agile team as half of the UX team, developing this cool software for large healthcare companies. And so now, what I really want to talk about is what it's like to be the UX person on an Agile team in a startup doing Agile, on the ground. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both. And the talk is a little bit sort of pasted together, but I hope it will be interesting and fun anyway. You may notice some typos and things that don't work exactly right as we go along. My excuse for that is we closed our sprint yesterday, and I started our next sprint today, and I expect lots of love from the room for that, or at least lots of leeway for that. All right, so let's talk about innovation. What do people say about innovation? innovation. You know, the myth that we all tell ourselves about innovation. You've got two smart guys in the garage, and you know they do smart stuff very smartly for some long amount of time, and then they produce stuff, right? Well, no, that's not what innovation looks like in the real world. And it's a nice myth, it's a good myth, but it's not what innovation looks like in the real world. All right, but you say, you know, what about those guys? You know, those guys, we know those guys existed. They created their companies in a garage. We have the stories, right? Yeah, okay, sometimes. But in the real world, not very often, right? What does innovation really look like in the real world? Let's look at some cases and let's talk about what it took for those people to do what they did, all right? So I want to look at two different cases. The first one is everybody's favorite, the iPhone, right? So the iPhone comes out, it completely blows up the market, it creates this whole new market for touchscreen hand displays, and for instant on, available always, ever connected mobile life that we are all living now, all right? There's another fascinating topic that I'm also going to not to do, which is exactly how much and how profoundly these devices have transformed our lives. Because, you know, we all like to make fun of them. It's like, you know, everybody's running around, you know, we're all sitting around the table going like this, right? Instead of talking to the people who are with us. And so it's easy to make fun of them, but the change they have made to our lives is truly profound. They aren't making $1 billion off of these devices for nothing. Okay? But what I want to focus on and give you an understanding and appreciation of is to what degree this innovation required long-term constant focus. And yet, at the same time, to what degree this was not a huge, gigantic leap into the dark. The iPhone was the next right thing for Apple. It was just the next step for Apple. And every step they've taken since then has been the next step for Apple. So let's talk about what happened in order to introduce the iPhone. Right? In order to make this thing, let's look at what really, really had to happen. So, what time is it? It's the turn of the century, the beginning of the new millennium. All right? Remember what it was like back then. I look around the room and I think you all probably remember what it was like. Okay? Including me. Okay, so wireless is available. It's becoming pretty much expected. It's not like it is now. It's not ubiquitous. It's not easy to connect to. Wireless networks was like, this was the war chalking years. Remember war chalking? You drive around, there are little symbols on the walls indicating that there's an unsecured wireless network here. Okay, so it's becoming available. It's around. Cell phone network. We've introduced 3G in Japan. They're playing with it over in Europe. The US is lagging way far behind. But we're coming along behind. We're selling smartphones, but the US sucks. I don't know if you remember what it was like in those days. I remember my first network-enabled smartphone, internet-enabled smartphone. I think it was a Nokia. There was no concept of using an actual browser on this device. And I'm sitting in New York going, is MoMA open, right? I forget what holiday it was. It made me think this was a question, but that was the question. Is MoMA open? That was all I wanted to know. I spent the entire breakfast, which was 45 minutes anyway, trying to answer the question, is MoMA open? And I actually found information about MoMA online, but none of it included hours. And it was all desperately difficult. And so we had, you know, what was the hot thing? The hot thing was downloading ringtones, right? Ooh, it's a new ringtone, okay. And that was as exciting as it got, and that was as successful as it got. But everybody had one because we all wanted to talk to each other, right? So they were in place, they were working, the consumers were ready to use them, the technology was there. We did, in fact, have touch screens. They weren't very good, but they existed. People were using them on GPSs, right? So the technology was kind of okay coming along. Ground had been laid. What about the consumer? Okay, everybody's got it, right? Now, if this was the grand age of the BlackBerry, right? All the managers running around with their thumb keyboards and The BlackBerry had broken open the business market in a way that nothing else before it had, right? If you were a businessman, you loved your BlackBerry. If you were a salesperson, you loved your BlackBerry, okay? And you lived off it. At this point, the internet had really gone from that weird geeky thing to the thing everybody uses, right? We were seeing blogs, we were seeing sales sites. I forget exactly when Facebook came in, but it was somewhere in here. So people were starting to get comfortable with using the internet. It felt like something that everybody could do, and people were even starting to make a little bit of money off of it, right? We had gone through the crash in the 2000s when the internet bubble burst because everybody looked around and said, hey, everybody's spending money producing all this content, but nobody's actually paying for it. Well, in this millennium, people actually started to pay for stuff. So the business model started to make sense. So again, the ground from the customer point of view, it started to get laid. What about the business model? Okay, this is a whole new business. I cannot count for you the number of companies that have tried to change their business and failed completely. So Apple is a computer maker. Can they sell a phone? Well, they know how to make computers. What's a phone but a computer? They know how to make screens. They're good at that. And they know how to make consumer electronics. At this point, they've already introduced the iPod. They've already introduced Newton and had it fail. And this is actually a positive point because doing something and having it fail and learning from the failure and going ahead and doing it better is an interesting learning process. So they knew what worked and they knew what didn't work and they knew they were going to try again. Right? And the iPod, of course, was a big success in the consumer market. At this point, they had opened up their retail store, so they knew how to do consumer sales. And they also had opened up their iTunes store. So they knew how to do online sales, they knew that market, and Napster immediately rolled over and died for them. So they actually had a market to sell into, right? A market that at this point was accepting that it was actually going to pay for songs. And they were able to cut some good business deals. So up until this point, anybody who tried to do something on a cell phone had to deal with the carriers, and the carriers said every one of our phones has to look exactly like every one of our other phones from the point of view of the interaction and the software. And I was working on both sides of the fence as a consultant at this time, so I was talking to both of them. And the carriers were adamant. And the big issue was support. We cannot support this device if the consumer calls up and says, what about this? And we can't see exactly what they say. So Apple was able to break that with their AT&T deal. And so they were able to retain control of their design, and they were able to build on the iTunes model in order to do their app store and have a business model that they knew would work. Okay, so the ground had been laid, as it were, right? What about the company mission and skill? Are they able to actually execute on this design? Well, I want you to look at this and look at the time frame. Okay, so Apple spends 10 years in the wilderness or whatever it was. 1997, Steve Jobs comes back. Next year, we released the iMac, big success. We released a new big failure. 1999, Apple registers iPhone.org. Okay. At this point, they've done a little bit with iPods and the failed PDA, which was the Newton, and they're registering iPhone.org in 1999. Okay. Year 2000, Mac cute design. 2001, iPod and OS X come out, very nice designs. And 2002, we file for the iPhone trademark. Okay. So we're still thinking about how are we going to be selling this phone. 2003, the model is building up. We have 23 million iTunes downloads. We're starting to prove this. In 2005, we produced a video. iPod's not until 2007 that the iPhone actually launched, which means that Apple has spent 10 years from the first public announcement of their intention, and of course there must have been a couple of years before that, building up to that, to the actual delivery of the first version of the iPhone. I've been a consultant for 22 years, working with companies all across the US and internationally, and I will tell you that the number of companies that can have a strategy and execute to it for 10 years, straight hand running is minuscule. I would go into these companies and they go, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. 2 years later, it's a new manager, right? Oh, we're doing that, we're doing that. 2 years later, it's a different manager. Oh, we're doing something, right? The ability to focus and stay focused for this period of time is a rarity. And if you can do it, the results can be phenomenal. But it takes that kind of long-term commitment to developing them, so yeah, okay, flash in the pan, spark, lightning strikes, you have your focus idea, and then are you willing to work on it for 10 years? Because if you're talking about real innovation, that may well be what you're talking about. Okay? So, what about the iPhone? We built on all of this technical experience that brought us to the point where we could actually produce the thing and have it be acceptably robust. You remember the first iPhone that came out? You remember how you touch the screen and it was like you were touching the thing? You move the map and the map would stay glued underneath your finger like it was really there. And you move the list and the list would reach the end, it would do that little bounce thing. Bouncy. That was the first version. Everybody says that other company, it takes 3 versions before it's knocked right. The first version of the iPhone came out and it was slick. That wasn't an accident. That was partly because Apple is committed to that, but it was a lot because of this experience. They had a whole lot of prior experience being committed to that. We sold it into a market that was prepared for it. We had already proven the business model that we could leverage. And over the decade, we delivered through something that if one had a certain set of glasses on, one might call multiple iterations, each building on the one before, with feedback from the market, and each one delivering user value, right? I don't know where I've heard those words before, but it's like an echo in my head, okay? So as they went through, they figured out, the iPod was a success, iTunes was a success, the Mac was a success, the iMac was a success, right? Now we get to the iPhone, okay? So they're iterating over time to produce this, this result. And that took both the capability to do the iterations, because you can't spend 10 years doing nothing, right? You have to deliver successful products over the course of that 10 years. Or you won't be in business long enough to actually realize your vision. So they were able to do that, but they were also able to stay focused. And I think this is one of the core aspects of innovation that we need to not forget. This combination of in-the-weeds delivery of successful products and good products, right? While simultaneously maintaining this focus on the long-term vision. Okay. All right, so that's Apple, that's the iPhone. Let's do a different one. Let's do a really different one. Another big innovation in our industry that everybody loves to talk about. Your spreadsheets. Different kind of story, right? Because we don't have one company with this long-term vision and executing to it over a decade. We still have a decade or two. But rather than this one company, we have multiple companies picking up the ball and taking it forward. Okay? First was VisiCalc. VisiCalc, invented by Dan Bricklin in the late 70s. Lots of myths told about how he came to develop it. Yeah. Okay.
I was just wondering about with Apple, it took a decade to get the iPhone out. I figure in this day and age, if you took 10 years to get the product out, the competition would have beaten you out to it at least 5 times already. So why didn't some competition come out and beat them out if it took 10 years?
2 things. One is they had the idea 10 years before they actually shipped, right? So, and in the interim, they were shipping. They just weren't shipping phones, right? But they were shipping things that would be get them to the point where they could ship the phone. The other thing is, what is this thing about being beaten by the market, or being beaten to market? I cannot count the innovations that have been first to market? Was the iPhone first to market? It certainly was not. Was it the first successful cell phone? It certainly was not. At the time the iPhone came out, it was like, the BlackBerry owns the market. How is anybody going to break into that, right? How is anybody, you've already got the whole market. Before the BlackBerry came out, Nokia owns the whole market. Nokia's got the best phones out there. Nobody else is going to break in until the BlackBerry comes along. And then BlackBerry has the whole market. Nobody's going to break in until the iPhone comes along. iPhone's got the whole market. Nobody can take the market from the iPhone until the Android comes along. Right? So in the end, I really don't believe that. I believe that if you're delivering good product and if you have a reason for anybody to buy it, then you can still win. The spreadsheets are going to tell us a similar story. So let's do that story and then we can talk some more about that. So Dan Breglow invents VisiCalc. How did he come to invent VisiCalc? He's a friend of Karen Hostblatt. So I called him up and said, Dan, tell me the story. He says, I went for my MBA because I wanted to do startups. And so I'm sitting in this excruciatingly boring lecture in which the professor is showing us a spreadsheet, because the term spreadsheet actually doesn't come from computers. Accountants have been doing spreadsheets for billions of years. And so it's this paper spreadsheet, and every time he wants to show us how the change here affects the result, he has to redo all these calculations. So he says, I had this vision where you could have a floating keyboard that would like stick to your fingers and a wall-sized display, and you move the keyboard like this, and the cursor on the display would move up like that, and you type in a new number, and all the numbers would cascade down through the entire spreadsheet. And that was my vision, okay? And what he shipped ran on a computer this big, with a display this big. It had, I don't know how many cells you could fit on it, but not very many by modern standards. It had a weird command language thing where you typed in your formulas. It was so dumb, it didn't even understand operator precedence. It just took the operators in the order that you typed them. It was a glorified adding machine, right? It even did adding the way you do an adding machine. So what did Dan Breglow become? Dan Breglow didn't invent anything particularly special, except in industry. He didn't invent anything particularly special. All he did was marry two existing ideas. The adding machine, the calculator, which already existed, right? And he put it on a personal computer, which already existed. And data spreadsheet, which already existed, right? It all already existed, okay? But it was the next right thing. He brought together these elements in a new and interesting way, and the result was that an industry was created. It was the first time that anybody who wasn't a geek wanted a computer, right? Because all those accountants said, I gotta have this account. And so they bought computers in order to run this account. Okay, but what happened? Well, a bunch of things happened, but one of the things that happened is that the vision of that company remained limited. And I want to say of the company rather than to him, because what you can do when you're in a company limited by all that stuff is what it is. And so I just want to focus on the result, which was that they weren't able to expand beyond their original vision, which is we do calculations in this spreadsheet kind of way. And this is another example of, okay, you've got your established competitor, right? How can anybody take the market away from VisiCalc? Along comes Lotus 123 and says, you know what? Spreadsheets aren't actually about calculation. Yeah, you have to calculate, but they're really about presentation. It's about producing something that you can then show to your board or put up on a screen or pass out to all the people who matter, right? And VisiCalc introduced all of these additional functions which basically allowed you to make your spreadsheets look the way you wanted them to look. And VisiCalc became the thing that nobody could beat, right? Not VisiCalc, excuse me. Lotus 123 became the thing that everybody wanted to beat. And for a while, Lotus was king, right? And everybody thought that no one would ever unseat Lotus until Microsoft came along with Microsoft Excel, which had been sort of putzing along as a not very successful software product until Windows 3 came along, which was the first windowing version of Microsoft's operating system. And they went into it big with the Office products, which no one else did because everybody else thought it was going to fail. And the result was that Microsoft was delivering not just an app, but an ecosystem, right? Not just a spreadsheet, but a spreadsheet that actually worked with their presentation and word processing software. And the combination, both from the business point of view and from the technical point of view, meant that they took over, right? And no one's ever really taken the ball from them since. And we still don't have wall-size displays, and we still don't have floating keyboards, and maybe we don't even want them. But over these 2 decades, the industry has progressed this concept towards what we have today, which is the spreadsheet as a expected, of course you have it, kind of tool that every business uses. Okay? So again, what do we see? We see that, it takes multiple years, in this case, multiple decades, and in this case, over multiple companies, to get to this overall vision, right? If VisiCalc had been able to maintain the same kind of focus and go through the same kind of transformations, who knows what they could have done, right? But in fact, it was done by multiple companies. All right, so what does that tell us? There's this interesting playoff between vision and iteration. You gotta have the vision or you don't know where you're going, right? You gotta have the concept, iPhone.org, right? What does that mean? Goddamn, I don't know, but it's a cool concept. Isn't it a cool concept, right? Iteration gets you there. And the agile way of thinking about iteration gets you there in coherent, useful steps, each of which delivers business value, and from each of which you learn and iterate, right? So if you can do that, if you can really deliver, if you can figure out how to deliver value every time, and if you can learn from your mistakes, which is hard, then you can get somewhere, okay? All right, so when I talk about innovation, that's what I'm talking about, all right? So, the issue is, it is very hard to maintain that vision, right? The old saying, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember that you came to drain the swamp, right? There you are, you got the flag on the hill, you're marching towards the flag on the hill, but you're not really marching, you're slogging because it is, after all, a swamp, and besides, alligators, right? Okay. Agile doesn't help you with that. Agile isn't going to help you drain the swamp. Agile is the swamp, right? Agile says, no, you're going to iterate in small chunks, right? And what does iterating in small chunks do? It keeps you from being strategic, and it takes your eye off the vision by design, right? This is not Agile's defect. This is Agile's strength. It just doesn't have to be the strength for maintaining your vision, okay? Agile says, don't try to get out of the swamp, get down and dirty with the swamp. Make close, intimate love to the alligators in this. Excuse me, that didn't go where I wanted to go. Let's do something different. Let's choose a different metaphor. Okay, whack-a-mole. Okay, I like the whack-a-mole metaphor. It's less dirty than the swamp in every sense. Okay, so the idea of whack-a-mole, right, is you've always got moles and you whack them. And this is what Agile is really good at. Every sprint, you've got a whole bunch of new moles, and you decide how many moles you can handle in the sprint, and then you go whack, 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 and then at the end of the sprint, you count up the number of moles you whacked, and okay, now you got a new set of moles, okay? If that, yes?
So, but you always have to go back and look at the vision, right? Because when you're that deep in the swamp, you can.
Of course you do, of course you do, absolutely. Now the issue is, how do you do that, right? Because Agile by itself, all of the ceremonies and processes of Agile are going to stick your nose back down in the weeds, right? Down there with the alligators. So, how is that, right? You know, if you talked to me 2 years ago, I would have told you pretty much the same story. I've been living this life now, and it's like, oh my God, you know, tomorrow I have to work on the UI stories for this sprint. Because if I don't get that UI work, then the developers are going to do something really stupid, and then we're going to have to retrofit it in order to get the right UI on, and we've done that, and that doesn't work very well because then you have a lot of rework to do, and you know, inside a 2-week sprint, there's no time for rework. So I, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to be in the stand-up going, okay, what are the UI stories? Because I have to start working on them now. Okay, this is the life of Agile, right? And maintaining any kind of strategic focus while you're living that life is hard. The stories themselves, intentionally, each one delivers user value, right? Each one is a chunk which is not only small enough to be done in a sprint, but it's small enough to be done in a sprint along with a whole bunch of other stories. So it's got to be way smaller than you need to do in a sprint. And therefore, your design is broken up. When you're thinking strategically, you're thinking about the whole system, how it all works together, how the parts work together. The user's life is the whole life. How does the whole system fit with the whole life? Where should it be going? What parts of the whole life am I not actually supporting so the system could expand to cover them, right? This one, right, stick it out, down here. That's the life of Agile, right? It's hard. Okay, the 2-week cycle. Oh my God, right? I can't think the thought bigger than 2 weeks. I have this great design. We're going to choose this great design. It solves the whole workflow process for this user. Okay, here's the design. Okay, don't you love my design? The users love my design. I did a whole bunch of user testing with my design, and they love it. Here are the engineers. Actually, here are the engineers. Use your knife. Still too big. We can do this, right? We can do this. Okay, we'll do that. Oh, and this? No, not that. We can do this. This is the life of Agile, okay? So it encourages you to think not in big chunks, but in terms of the tiny little pieces, right? It focuses you there. And, nobody says anything bigger isn't worth doing, but that ends up being the feeling, because it always has to be broken down into something small in order to fit into the sprint so that you can actually do it. Okay. A lot of people talk about lean UX. I actually love lean UX from the point of view of the perspective it brings and the interaction with the developers and so forth. I think it's a win. And, I know Jeff and I like him, but it doesn't solve this problem either. Because what it does is it pushes you even closer to the alligators, aka the engineers, and say, no, you should be working side by side with them and developing the UX in parallel with them. And all of this is good stuff, as opposed to this hand-off process. And all of this is good stuff, but it doesn't help you be more strategic. In fact, it makes it harder. And, well, it's a different thing. But for years I've known that I can be a decent UX person, I can be a decent engineer, I can be a decent UX person, I can be a decent engineer, or a decent UX person, or a decent engineer, that if I try to bring these two together into one head, I am a lousy UX person and a lousy engineer. But a worse UX person than engineer, because the engineering side of me always wins, because that's who I am. And because when you're living in that headspace, you're always going, well, it would be much easier and more elegant if I just did this, right? And it's really hard to go, but if you do that, the user won't have a clue what's going on anymore, because it's such a different approach to the situation and the problem. Okay, so enough about the problems. Let's talk about what's our job? Why are we here? What is UX supposed to be up to? Let's start from there. Well, UX delivers the right experience for users. What does that mean? That means the system does what I want in a way I can understand so I can achieve what I'm trying to do. Okay? That is a real clear statement of what UX is all about. Not for this talk, right? On another day when I'm not feeling busy, I might agree with that. Not for this talk, not today. What is UX? The system does what I didn't know I wanted. Does it in a way that I can adopt without a struggle. Okay? To achieve a goal I care about. Right? The system does what I didn't know I wanted. This is the difference between iteration and being strategic. No one wanted an electronic spreadsheet. No one was running around asking for an electronic spreadsheet, right? Once they saw the electronic spreadsheet, then they wanted it, okay? But they didn't know they wanted it. When the cell phone first came, the first cell phones, when they first came out with cameras, I'm like, who would put a camera on a cell phone? Who wants a camera on a cell phone, right? I use my camera on my cell phone 5 times a day. From every, taking pictures, screw that, I'm going to use it as a copier. I use it as a documentation device. I use it to capture my receipts. I use it to scan barcodes, right? I use it for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with taking pictures. Okay? Henry Ford said, if I listened to my customers, I'd be building bigger horses or something. So, system has to do not what they ask for, not what they want, not what they know they need, but what you discover they need because you've learned about them, because you understand what they're up to and what their issues are and what they care about. But I can adopt without the struggle. So you're going to be introducing new stuff, right? And as a UX person, of course, people ought to be able to pick it up and use it just cleanly, easily. But there is always going to be some kind of learning process. Question is, how much of a struggle is it? Is it work? Right? I remember when cell phones first came out, and it was like, oh, man, I'm an engineer, but what do I really want to come up to speed on a whole new technology with all this new stuff, downloads and ringtones and all this, right? And now it's easy, right? You pick up your iPhone, you touch your tiles, you put the call, you bitch about this or that aspect of the UI, but you're bitching about something that actually works, right? And it works for you. So it shouldn't be work to learn, but you're going to have to learn, right? Because it's work. And to achieve a goal I care about, so which helps me achieve something that I want. Did I know that I wanted my kids to be updating me with pictures and status a couple of times a day? I didn't exactly expect to want that. But it's kind of cool now that I've got it, and they're all out of the house. So it's the ultimate goal that I care about, but it never would have occurred to me to ask you to help me with that, right? You're a cell phone. They're not going to call me. I already know they're not going to call me, so you can't help with that. Well, actually, you can. So it's this marriage of what the user does, what they care about, and what your technology makes feasible, and what you can design. Right? That is interesting. And this is what innovation is about. When you are doing iterative design, when you're down in the weeds with the alligators, right? What you're doing is doing iterative improvements to a task. You're playing whack-a-mole, okay? Which means that you will improve, right? You will improve the task, and you will transform things bit by bit, but slowly, right? And without an overall plan. If you got your innovation, if you got iPhone.org, if you got your concept of the spreadsheet on the gigantic wall, then you're marching towards something, right? You're still whacking moles. You still have your 2-week sprints. But now you're doing it in the context of an overall vision and an overall direction. And that's what can make innovation. Your stepwise iteration transforms tasks. Innovation is transforming life, right? It's making the user's life better. It's not just making the specific tasks a little more efficient. And in fact, that's one of the things that we often have to talk to usability people about. Because if you've got a background in usability training, what you've learned is to look for problems. And UX is not about looking for problems. It's about looking for, it's a cliche to say it's about looking for opportunities. But it's about looking for ways in which you can transform users' lives through the technology that you have at hand. Okay, so what does it take to do this? You really have to know the users, right? You got to walk in their shoes, you got to live their life with them, you got to understand how it goes on, which means you've got to do some kind of user-centered design, field research, contextual inquiry is what I've spent the last 20 years doing with this. It works very well. I spent 20 years talking about it. I decided not to talk about it today, so that's all I'm going to say. okay? But you gotta get out there, you gotta talk to your users, and you gotta see what's going on in the real world. And you have to have a process which is going to drive that understanding all the way through. So it's not enough just to go, ooh, this is not a design from my heart. Although there's a lot of design from your heart that goes on, you have to have a process by which you can formalize, represent, communicate, and design from your learnings. And then take those designs, produce them into little bitty pieces, each of which delivers some kind of concrete user value. Because after all, we're still in the iterative process. And the overall process has to be iterative, right? You aren't going to get it right the first time. And even if you were perfect, there will be emergent requirements that you will not learn until you have seen your design in place, okay? This does not mean that you have to implement first, although Agile makes it really easy to implement quickly and test what you've implemented and then go back and iterate again. If you have a process which allows you to create stories as you go, as opposed to one of those processes where you have your big spec, which you break up into stories, which you break into iterations, which you implement without ever actually redesigning your stories or learning as you go. In which case, there are certain people, such as me, who argue you're not really doing Agile at all. If you're not doing that, then Agile does make it easy to test as you go, which is where I started that sentence with and sort of lost my way along the way. Okay, so you're not going to get it right the first time, but where I was actually going was that you don't have to do that. You can also do paper prototypes, which can test concepts if they're rough, and they can test function and structure if they're reasonably detailed, and they can actually test elements of the UI if you make them pretty enough, basically. I have a prototype in my bag right now, which is sort of halfway along the way. I decided I had to make it reasonably pretty in order to get the level of feedback that I needed, but that was a special case. Yeah.
Question relating to the Agile.
Yeah, so in Agile, clearly the iteration is embodied by the Scrum team. In Agile, with the innovation, provided the customer does it right, be captured by the interaction with the customer. So that the customer is providing, the constant contact with the customer gets you the innovation and the updates of the vision and so on. And the sprint gets you the iterations, and therefore Agile could be a complete process that integrates vision and iteration.
Absolutely, that's where I'm going. Yeah. Yes, and I will argue that you can't in the end, generally, pretty much mostly, innovate if you don't have good customer data, if you don't have a good solid grounding in what's going on with your customers. Because after all, where else is innovation going to come from? Your competitors? Well, then you're following your competitors, you're not so much innovating, right? From the technology? Well, then you got cool technology, but who's going to buy it? Then no, right? So there's that. I wanted to cycle back and talk about emergent requirements for just a minute. It is remarkable how much a paper prototype can recreate or create for the first time reality that doesn't exist yet, and you can learn from that reality. I'm remembering, since we were just talking about cell phones, in the late 90s for, I think it was Compaq at the time, who was interested in doing small mobile devices. We called them PDAs at the time. And I was talking to a executive secretary about how she would communicate with her boss. And she starts out, well, of course, if my boss is in the meeting, I would never interrupt. Never, never, never. Don't even go there. And so we work through our little communication thing, and then I point out, so here you are, and write this, and it just like pops up on your boss's screen, nobody else sees it. And so we go on and go on, and then I say, so this emergency thing happens. Would you interrupt your boss? In a minute. Absolutely. Right? So she goes from never not going to happen to, oh yeah, in this situation, in this context, understanding, right? Now, of course, what world are we living in now, right? Excuse me. No, it's not important, right? So, you can see where the practice is going if you create the context in which to get that feedback. And you can do it through the iterations, but you don't have to, or you can do it through the development iterations, but you don't have to. You can do it through your own iterations, which I'll talk about. Okay. Main point for right now is you're not going to get it right the first time. build into your process the iterations that are going to allow you to learn. Okay, so what's our job as the UX people on an Agile team? What? We have to do the user research, right? We have to go out there into the field and learn who the users are. We have to drive the strategic vision, which means that as we discover through our user research that the business focus is wrong or is not addressing an opportunity or is constrained in some way that it doesn't need to be, we need to bring this back to the business and foster a conversation about what are we up to, and is that the right thing to be up to, and how does it need to be tweaked, and are there new opportunities that we aren't paying attention to drive the strategic vision. From that, we're going to be able to say, okay, if that's what we're up to, this is how the system needs to be designed to support those users in the tasks that we have said we will support them. And then we have to, by the way, do a good UI, which has a nice flow, which is pretty, the rest of that stuff. And at least in my organization, we also have to support the implementation because we are also the team who's doing the HTML and CSS and all that good stuff to actually make the face, okay? So we're doing the styling in the code as well as all the rest of the stuff. And that's all, right? Oh, by the way, in 2 weeks. Now, I will tell you that as a consultant in the user-centered design field, we were fairly proud of ourselves of doing in 2 months what other companies took 6 months to do, right? In 2 months, 3 months, 3 months would be a biggish project, we would do pretty much all of this, right? Down to here. We wouldn't do the implementation. But we could go out and get like 20 user interviews and come up with a vision with you, and design you a system, and test and iterate you want. We could do that. But it took us 3 months, and it took us a team, and it took us a focus that allowed us to do that, nothing else, right? Because we were, after all, a consultant coming in and doing this in focused time. Okay. And if I were going to draw a fancy little process diagram, because everybody loves fancy process diagrams, it might look something like this. Right? You got your research, and out of this, you're going to deliver, hang on. Out of this, you deliver user models, personas, task analyses, all of that kind of good stuff. And you do it through field research, market analysis, surveys, whatever processes you decide you want to use. Okay. That user research is then going to give you a good picture of who your users are and how they operate. This drives our strategic conversation, right? Product and business direction, design concepts, and prioritization. But it's a bigger conversation than just development, right? This is about who are we as a business, who are our customers, how do we serve them, right? Given our expertise, our business focuses. Which then drives a level of architecture. The work at the architectural level, which is easy to skip because if you don't know it, do it, nobody notices until they're asking why your system doesn't work very well. For the UX group at this level, it's storyboards, it's 2D scenarios. Contextual design includes a user environment design, which is like a product floor plan for the entire product. This is the level at which you generate style guides, at which you generate design patterns, right? So these are the elements that are going to hold the system together as a whole, right? Keep all the parts bolted together. Then we get down to design proper. Design is an overused word. At this point, I'm using it to mean really the design of the look. So at this point, we're doing the detailed UI designs. We might start with wireframes, but we're moving on into the actual look, the graphic treatment, everything that the user can see. And finally, we're doing the implementation. Okay? If we were waterfall, we would do the research for a couple of months. We would do the strategy for a couple of months, and then do it again. And then we did the architecture for an infinite amount of time, and then we did the design when somebody said we actually had to ship something and it wouldn't give it enough time, and then we spent a bunch of time doing implementation and redoing interest. We did it wrong. And that would be, and then we shipped something that nobody wanted. And that would be the waterfall process, right? Interesting, now I'm a couple of months out of the consulting life, and it's interesting the degree to which what we did was squash that. But we didn't really change it a lot because, of course, when you're a consultant, it's an engagement. You're in, you do the engagement, you're out. So everything has to fit into that time. It has to be crammed into that time because after all, the client's paying for it, the client will only pay for so much. So everything that we did assumed that. Okay? And we do have iteration all the way along, right? It's not that you can't be iterative in the context of this kind of a workflow style process. But the iterations, because you're moving from phase to phase to phase, the iterations don't feed across phases. So that's cool, but it's not what we're doing these days. What we're doing these days is we're taking the whole thing and we're marching across it this way, right? So with every sprint, we have a little research, a little strategy, a little architecture, a little design, far too much implementation to my taste, and every sprint we have to do all of it, okay? Now, I didn't think I was going to want this picture yet. No, I don't want that picture yet, so I'll tell you from that story. So in every sprint, we have to allocate a certain amount of time to all that stuff. If we don't do a little of this, and a little of this, in every sprint, we aren't going to have any of this. That's going to suck completely, and we're going to spend all of our time playing whack-a-mole, right? And if you can't tell, I hate whack-a-mole. It's like, okay, yeah, fine, I whack that mole, I whack that mole's hand is sore, but you know what? In a couple of minutes, he's just going to stick it up again. So you don't ever get anywhere playing whack-a-mole. Yeah.
Well, forgive me for saying this, but in a way, I sort of see that kind of like what was.
Kind of like what?
Kind of like rationing
Yeah.
in a way, right? Each is like a.
Yeah. Looks like the big, I was talking to someone just the other day who said, yeah, that contextual design thing was too big to do in the process. I said, no, you weren't really supposed to implement it that way. What do you mean you were supposed to implement it that way? I totally actually was on his side. I understood what he was saying. I said, I know that I can open the book and point you to the words that say, do not do these as one big concept, a second big concept, a third big concept, a fourth big concept. I can point you to those words. But of course, the whole structure of the book sort of assumed that that was what you were doing. The whole presentation assumed that's what you were doing. So it's like a UI problem, right? If the whole structure of the book says, do it this way, I can't point to one sentence that says, no, don't do it that way, and claim that, it's okay. So yeah, that's like a limitation in our presentation, not because we weren't thinking about it, but because we were so buried in that life that it was almost impossible for us to present it any other way. So I'm now like 2 solid months, since Thanksgiving, however long that's been, in this different life. And so now I have a totally different perspective. Of course, 2 years from now, I'll have a completely different perspective again, but this is what I got right now. Okay. So, where was it? You got to do all this stuff, right? And you still got to do it. You don't get out of doing it, right? You don't get to say, well, you know what, this all looks, very much sort of like that old stuff, and I don't really want to do it anymore, so we just won't. No, you don't get to do that. You don't understand your users, you're going to shit crud. You know that, okay? You don't have a decent strategy, you might build the right stuff, but you're not going to be able to sell it, you're not going to have a structure of business that can actually produce it. You don't have a good architecture, excuse me, you're still going to shit crud. You got to spend some time on the design. If you don't want to do that, I can show you any number of counterexamples proving that skipping that step is a bad idea. And implementation everyone will do, which means that you got to work against it, right? 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to tell the developers that yes, I will work on this story, but you know what? I have to spend at least half the day doing something else than working on this stories. And I got to do that this sprint, and I got to do that next sprint, and I got to do that the sprint after, right? So my tasks for tomorrow include working on our style guide, which is not in any kind of shape. It includes setting up an interview with a nurse, which we don't have enough of yet. So I got to do some of that. I want to sit down with my CEO and talk about some interesting implications about the data we've already gathered for our service, indicating that if we could just extend our service this way, which will be hard, they would press rubies in our ears. I got to do some of this for not only this design, but for the next design, for the next sprint. And of course, I do have to do other opportunities. Right? This sprint, next sprint, and after that, every sprint, this is the life. Okay. Which means we can't do the things that we used to do the way we used to do them. This is one of our models that we produced back when I was a consultant. Back in the old days, when I was a consultant, we would produce user models that look like this. And they were beautiful, and they were very complete, and they were actually, they were awesome. You could get lots and lots of insight out of a model like this. And they didn't take us that long to produce, maybe a month, okay, of a team of 2, 3. Okay, that's 2 sprints, right? And we didn't yet have a design. I had to feed the developers, right? 2 sprints to do this, maybe another 2 sprints to actually work this out into a design, then cut it up into stories, right? We're talking real time here. We're talking multiple sprints. We're talking an eternity in Agile sprints. So this is what our user models look like now, okay? And not only that, when you see this little E5, this is user 5, okay? So I'm realizing I don't get to collect as much data as I want before I have to start using it. I hope over time, next year, you will corner me and say, so what happened? And I hope to be able to tell you that all of these models, which this year are single person models, have turned into multiple person roll-ups, right? And I hope to tell you that we now have personas that are actually worth something, because I've talked to multiple people who represent each persona, and so I actually know who these people are. It's not there yet, and I can't afford to wait to be there, right? I have to be the developers. I have to write stories. I have to get implications out of the data as I gather, and I don't have the luxury of waiting. Okay? So, okay, it's one user, but you know what? It's a good user. It's good information. We're going to start building off of that information, and next sprint, we'll talk to another person like this, and we'll get a more complete view, which will add to this. But one of the nice things about user data is that you never discover it's wrong. I mean, the users are the users. They do what they do. It's not like you're going to suddenly discover it's invalid. So all we need to do is roll in, right? We'll build up from our initial understanding. And what that means is anytime you come to me and say, what are the user models, what are the implications, what do I do next, I have an answer, right? And it will be as complete as it is, just like the code is as complete as it is, right? But it is always at a state of ready to ship, right? So the UX deliverables have to be the same. They always have to be as good as they are, but ready to ship, right? Each one has to provide business value. Which is an interesting term. Okay, but I'll tell you more about that next. Do I have time? I do have time. All right. I'm thinking I'll go another 10 minutes or so, and then we can have questions, discussion. Okay, and what that means also is fall in love with low fidelity stuff. Okay, somebody was asking online the other day, what's the equipment that you need in order to do a contextual input? And people are saying, oh, well, videotapes, audio tapes, and when you take your key, when you take your key and you want this and that, no. Videotape, no, don't do it. Audio tape, no, don't do that either. Set it up with the fancy room with the heads and cups, don't do that, right? Set up a meeting, no, don't set up a meeting, okay? Just go there, talk to them. The only meeting you have to set up is one-on-one with the person in their workplace. You go, you have pad of paper, you have a pen, that's enough, right? Sketches, you saw the sketches, right? Make it beautiful one day. Maybe next year when you corner me, I'll be able to say, yes, not only do we have to roll up, but we made it beautiful, right? Because bit by bit, iteratively over time, we were able to improve the look as well as the content. Or maybe I'll tell you no, because we never needed to. Because that did not actually provide enough value to be worth it. I could feed the developers, I could feed the design, I could build up our vision without needing to do that. Do storyboards, do wireframes. One of the things I've introduced to my new company is a whole bunch of sketching, right? They're like, man, you sketch? I'm like, yeah, I sketch, right? I know the tools, I can use the tools, I'm a good tool user. Yeah? When I start, I sketch. Sketching pulls on a different side of the brain than tools do. Tools always over-focus you on the details, right? Even for a good user, even for a good tool, they over-focus you on the details. And paper prototypes, you build them in paper, you build them in Post-its, you hand draw them. I can do a prototype, I did that today, I can do a prototype in an hour or two, and that will get me good feedback, right? It doesn't just get me good enough feedback, it gets me good feedback, okay? Because the prototype itself helps with the process of getting feedback. It's flexible enough, it's rough enough to pull people in. Yeah.
I think about simulation. I mean, one thing is that, people look at paper, it's one dimensional. How
right into that, like
Okay.
Elon Musk.
This?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
You want me to begin?
So what do I feel about simulations? No, don't give it back. What do I feel about simulations?
Yeah, I mean, how do you think that's a little bit more high fidelity as opposed to low fidelity? But again, I think the people who get paid for it kind of, sometimes they could just glaze out.
I've never had to use a glaze out. So let me say a little bit more about that. No, let me start with a funny story. This is back in the contextual design days. We're doing a system to support lawyers. It's legal information systems. If you want, it's LexisNexis or something like that. So, if you want to find a boring project to work on, here you go. Okay. We had to drive over an hour to this interview. It's with a lawyer who are very hard to set up interviews with. The guy is an hour late. So, we only have 2 hours with him. He's now chopped an hour off of that. He blows in, he's in his three-piece suit. He's, the prototypical lawyer. I've been in 3 jurisdictions today. I can only give you 45 minutes. I can only give you 45 minutes. Okay. No, we'll go here. Okay, sit down, everybody. Now, what are we going to do? Okay. So I'm thinking, oh man, this is going to be a disaster. 3 hours later, right? 3 hours after he showed up, I'm in the corner. Oh man, can this thing be over already? And he's sitting at the head of the table. He's got a hunk of our paper prototype in his right hand. He's gesticulating with her. And what you need to do is, what this has to do is, this is right. This is right. Not that like this. If you do the process right, then the paper prototypes can be engaging, right? Because people have a feeling that they can change them. Because what you're doing is not showing them what you did, or asking them to run through a process. What you are doing is saying, okay, this is your system. Look, I'll put your data into it. Now, what are you doing? What's your current problem? What are you working on? Okay, do that, right? And then they go, well, I do this. And you go, okay, so that's, and then the system responds this way. And they go, that's stupid. And you go, oh, well, the system didn't respond this way. How does it respond? And I go, you should do this, okay? Now the system does that. What do you do now? Right, so it's a very interactive. So what do you need to do that? And that magic post-it tape that you can stick down and pull off, that's great. Post-its, yeah. Multicolored pens, you can have multicolored pens. Dots, blacks, those are nice, you don't need to have them, they're nice. That's it, right? No one-way mirror, no tasks defined ahead of time, no procedures, no protocols, no one-way mirror with the developer sitting behind it having their opinions, independent of you, and independent, by the way, of the user who's the only person who really knows anything on the road. No, none of that, okay? Isn't that wonderful? Because you get better data that way, and if it's adaptive, right? If it's into your tool express. Literally, I'm going yesterday. Oh my God, if I don't get this design tested with users tomorrow, I need today. I'm never going to be able to get the design finished in time to break up into stories and present to the engineers, right? And so I had better do that tomorrow. So I did it in the morning and set up the interview last night and tested it with the users this afternoon, right? That kind of fast iteration is possible. It was always possible. It was not necessarily so much. When you're living in the Agile world, it's necessary. Okay. Structurally, what does this look like? This is still a work in process. If you read my book, which is not that book, but the other book, it will describe some of this, but it's a little loosey-goosey on what happens over here. So let me tell you where we're at now. And like I say, it's a work in process, so I'll tell you some of the stuff that doesn't work so well. And what we're doing is we're doing our own sprints. Okay, the UX team has its own scrums and its own sprints. After all this time, we're thinking of breaking up the company, and I'm going, well, I've got all this, like industry experience, but I don't actually have any credentials or anything. So I went and got Agile certified, Scrum certified. I'm now a certified Scrum Master from Jeff Sutherland, who happens to be the guy who invented Scrum. And one of the interesting things about Scrum is that it's not actually a software development process at all. It started out way before Agile was an idea in anybody's mind. And what happened was, as a process management tool, system, whatever, Scrum pre-existed software development, and then software development projects said, hey, look at this is a good way to structure ourselves. And when XP came along, XP was really strong in the coding practices, but not so strong with the whole overall process management. So the Scrum and XP combination was a real natural fit, and that's what most people are doing these days. It is what's really a combination of Scrum and XP. But Scrum itself doesn't require that you code. This is one of, I always hated the terminology from Scrum of backlog items. It's like, it's not a backlog item, it's a design. You're building up a design, right? It's this whole, it's an elephant. Don't tell me you've got a backlog item, it's just like a thing in the trunk. But when you look at it from the point of view that it's not a software development process, your backlog items can be anything. In the Scrum language is a backlog item has to deliver business value, right? Not necessarily customer value, which is what XP would say with the user story, but business value. So whatever you do, every story has to deliver business value, which suddenly frees you to like do stuff which is valuable and you always knew it was valuable, but you never could fit it into the XP user story type box. So we have a backlog, and our backlog includes everything off of all of those layers that we talked about. And we have a velocity, and we estimate the amount of effort that all of our stories are going to take. And we do it in points, not in days. And our velocity is not stable yet. We haven't done enough of these sprints. We don't have enough under our belt yet. We, in every sprint, we have a mix of stories which are, high up in that diagram, user research and strategic level. We have some architecture stories. I have the story in our backlog right now, not in our backlog, in our current sprint, to clean up our style guide and get a framework in place so we can start putting there. All the way down to we have stories in our backlog which are to do the UI implementation for the current development sprint. Okay? So there are stories that have tasks in the development sprint which are duplicated as stories in our sprint. So there's a little duplication there. We decided it was better to live with that because the amount of extra work that creates is very small. And what it means is that our sprints represent all our work as opposed to having some of our work represented on the development sprint. And what this does is it allows us to run ourselves in a way that's compatible with the developers. Every sprint, we have stories which include write the stories or do the work to write the stories for the next development sprint. If we did tasks to our stories, which we currently don't, it would be like design this feature, which came off of this storyboard, which came from this larger vision, which was driven by our user models, which we got through our research, right, in prior time. But it's now gotten down to the point where we can actually build it into the story and push it out to development, into the development sprint, which is the other thing. Every one of our sprints is doing work to produce user value. User value may be a style, business value. Business value may be a style guide. Business value may be a better understanding of our customers. Business value may be an improvement to our overall UX architecture or better definition of what it is, like reading a style guide by writing user design patterns, whatever it might be. But we're not, the people who fall in love with lean UX tend to treat it as though all of that has to happen in one sprint, and it doesn't. If you've made it fit into one sprint, I am going to bet dollars to donuts that you are not doing anything particularly visionary, you are not doing anything particularly innovative. Because it simply takes more than 2 weeks to work through those designs and get it together. But you can have your own 2-week sprints where your stories make sense, right? And they progress all of those elements. And you don't have to wait to have a complete architecture and a complete strategy and a complete design in order to say anything in engineering, right? Every 2 weeks, you got to have a new set of stories ready to go, and they can't come from nowhere. You can't make them up, right? So you have to have enough architecture and enough strategy and enough design based on enough research to produce enough stories for development to do in your next sprint. Okay? One of the guy I'm working with, the other half of the UXP, who was one of the founders of the company, said to me, it would be really nice when we get out in front of engineering so that we have more backlog. And I'm like, sorry to tell you this, but that's not actually a goal, right? In the Kanban point of view, the more out in front we get, the more waste we have. progress yet, right? So in fact, we feel like we're scrambling, but that's Agile. Yeah, everything's produced just in time. And the feeling of producing everything just in time is that, you never had enough time, you never had quite enough time, right? And that's the life, right? That's the life. And the result is that we push through stuff pretty fast, because every 2 weeks we're asking ourselves, did we go after the field? Did we do our thing? Did we progress that style guide? Look, this style guide story has sat on our backlog for 3 sprints running. Why is that? Do we believe in it? If we don't believe in it, let's kick it off. If we do believe in it, let's get serious. Right? So it's a great way to orient ourselves as well as a great way to drive development. And as I say, that's totally canonical, standard Scrum, right? That's not some weird derivation of Scrum. That's just the way that Scrum can be used. So, that's what I got. That's where I'm at. Like I said, it's early days from the point of view of my experience in this company, and things will evolve, they will iterate, and we will learn from our mistakes. But that's where I've gotten to in terms of marrying the perspective I had from working across many companies in many years doing user-centered design, and now in a startup in a totally opposite end of the universe, doing this at the ground level to drive implementation. So, happy to take questions. I'm actually thinking, how long do we have? Like till 8:30? People feel like this is supposed to end at 8:30? Because if you say it was supposed to end 15 minutes ago, I'll say thank you. In that case, I want to hear, okay, we got a question. Yeah. You passed a bunch of questions. Let's try some back.
So when you're working in iteration, you've got a UX sprint and you've got a development sprint, and you're designing a sprint ahead.
No.
No?
No, not designing a sprint ahead. Because it's not that cut and dry. So we're doing all of this work every sprint. Some of it will be a sprint ahead, some of it will be multiple sprints ahead. Some of it is feeding our basic knowledge, which will eventually turn into something that we don't even know yet. Okay, go ahead.
So you're working within your team as a Scrum team, and you're handing, eventually, 1 or 2 sprints, you hand off a design to a dev team that's going to work in their sprint. So you're working in Agile fashion, they're working in Agile fashion, but your interface feels kind of waterfall.
Yes, that is so in a way. Okay? The issue about waterfall is not that we did work and then we did other work. Because the truth is, within our sprints, it's also, you can easily say that was waterfall, right? Because we have to get the research for the concept before we can have the concept. And we have to have the concept before we can build it into the architecture. And we have to have the architecture before we can do the design, right? So there are these stages that the thought goes through. The issue with waterfall is it built each of these stages and phases and said you have to do all of that work in this phase. That's not happening. Instead, we're doing in every phase, every sprint, we're doing all of it, right? And what that means is when we do feedback, our feedback is feeding every phase. Once I have my different idea of our business strategy, I can go get different user data to drive it, right? I can do different things in my architecture. When I get user data that tells me, fix this button on the UI, because nobody can find it because it's below the fold, I can drive that right into the hardly even design, right, into the implementation. All I have to do is fix the button, already designed it. So the iteration happens at every level as well.
Okay. But to what degree, if any, is there interaction between the designers and the developers? How do the developers get feedback about the fidelity of their implementation with respect to the design?
Within the sprint.
Within the sprint.
And that's the lean UX part.
Yeah.
Because, in fact, we have ongoing discussions about that. We're working with them, not only because we are working, in fact, on the code with them, on the front-end code, but when they do something that has UX implications, we have to sit with them and go, and what did that do? And when we do something that requires new stuff in the back end, then we have to coordinate on how is that going to happen. So the integration at that level is pretty tough.
So you have story points for the hand-holding support and back and forth?
That's built into the overall story pointing of the story. Right? So we don't measure out the UX work as in a separate bucket. What we do is we say, well, this story is going to be complex because look at that line interaction, right? Or the story is going to be complex because look at the database interaction, or whatever. Right? Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Make sure.
So how might you adapt this for more of a continuous flow kind of model? For example, if you were feeding a dev team that was doing more of a Kanban style, where you didn't
Like continuous integration?
Continuous integration, continuous delivery, or just trying to do like a single piece flow, where you didn't necessarily have the sprint boundaries, the time box when you needed to have it deliverable.
I will tell you that the more I do this, the more I'm not sure I believe in sprint boundaries. They are a useful conceptual concept, but it's like, okay, I did all the stories for my sprint, what am I going to do now? Sit around and play Skyrim for a while? Sure, fun, but we'll pull on the story, we'll do it. You know, if we overestimate our velocity and pull in too many stories, is the world going to end? Are we going to break this from? No, we're not. We're just going to not do that story. So, you know, it's not like the sprint boundaries mean anything in the big. What they mean is it's a regular heartbeat where you can check on your progress. So I don't know that I would change a whole bunch if I didn't have those boundaries. I would worry a lot about taking my eye off the ball because those kinds of ceremonies are focusing events. But I haven't lived in that process, so I don't really know. But from the point of view, you know, so you generate a new story, done the work to make sure it's right, you generate the story, you hand it off, the next developer who's free picks it up, they do the implementation, you get in there to make sure the details are right, maybe you do some user testing of the implementation if that's required, we're doing some user interaction right now, I'd like to do that. You declare it done, you move on. I don't know if you need this.
So I have actually a couple of questions. One of these is a bit of a challenge. I actually feel I've worked in web-heavy shops and back-end transaction shops, and I think one of the things that developers have sort of come to terms with Agile is the idea that refactoring is just a part of life. That, you know, we're going to do something, and part of the things that you talked about doing every iteration and every day are things that developers do every day in an Agile team. And I guess it seems like one of the big challenges is how to take UX to a place where it's not only okay, but baked in that you can refactor the design.
There is a difference between, a conceptual difference between what development is doing and what UX is doing. You can refactor code till the cows come home and be perfectly happy as long as you have a good texture. You can't refactor your users. One of my developers was bitching at me the other day because we use all these online tools which change every 5 minutes, right? And he's like, man, every time they move this button every time we change stuff. And every time they move it, I can't find it again. Because wherever they moved it to, it still doesn't work. So you can't refactor your users. And there's also this issue that if you're selling real products in the real world, then you also have to worry about what are you doing to the overall brand experience.
Sure.
As a good, dyed-in-the-wool, cast-iron, hard-shell developer from the most developer-y of companies, which was digital back in the day, I had no appreciation for the brand experience. That was for toothpaste, right? Then I spent 4 or 5 years working with GM. And of course, the brand experience, and in the Cadillac division, if you know the history of Cadillac, it was like they went through years where they were kicking their brand all over the place. I I say to them, so, what is it about Cadillac versus the Corvette? Because, the Cadillac has gone through this mess and they're reinventing themselves now very well. But Corvette never did that. You know exactly what the Corvette stands for. You know what you're getting if you get a Corvette. You know who's driving the Corvette. You know who's sitting in the passenger seat next to him. And you have opinions about all of it, and it's been the same. And he says, well, the truth is we've had the same manager, the same chief engineer, is what they call it, for the Corvette for 40 years. So we had a focus there and didn't have the Cadillac.
I guess what I'm trying to focus on though is the part before you've shipped, where you're iterating to the product you want to ship. And it seems that some part of the market is going with a much more experimental user multivariate testing approach to say what the market wants, as opposed to I've interviewed 5 people. Okay, I put it in front of 10,000 people or 1,000 people and use the data that I pull back out of that to say, you know what, my UX architecture and my systems architecture are wrong for that. So we're going back to
things like multivariate testing. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. One is, so you got to get the experience right, or you're going to screw up your brand. And if people get a bad taste in their mouths, they never really lose. Okay, that's one. The other one, which is about the A/B testing and what kind of testing does it take to iterate your UX, right? Because it's not just iterating the UI, it's iterating the UX. And I will argue that if you're doing A/B testing, good for you, but it's because you had a failure upstream. So, and at the margins, there's places where it works, but if you really don't know which of these two experiences are better, then either you're really tweaking the margins, which is fine, and there's a lot of places where that makes sense, or you screwed up upstream. You should know what your users need at that point. If you really understand your users well enough to innovate for them, you should know what they need. And you should have done the rough paper prototypes that make the fine paper prototypes most of the time unnecessary, right? So that's 90% answer. The 10% answer is, yeah.
In paper before you ever start building.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. I just did that, right? I was doing a redesign of a piece of a product, and I'm like, okay, there's no way we can get this right without running this by users. There was another piece which was all about finding stuff. I've been finding stuff for 30 years, right? In different domains, very, very different domains, from grocery shopping to legal research to you name it. And it's always the same. So when we're looking for stuff in our system, it's like, no, I know this problem. I can go a long way without a whole bunch of user data. In other parts of the problem, it's like, no, not even going to go close without user data. You have to know when you're in which situation. There was one more question from the middle. Yes, no? I shushed you earlier, so I wanted to come back and make sure.
I think it's relatively similar to the question we just had a bit earlier about incremental research and strategy up there.
Yeah.
That if doing a lot of iterative things there can lead to what might be called reverse implementation. Otherwise, we have to undo something you've implemented earlier, could otherwise be known as refactoring. You just put up with that, or do you try to avoid incremental research and strategy?
No, there's no avoiding that. You have to go and find out what you don't know in order to learn about what you don't know. So my first answer would always be, first get out there, then figure out what you're doing out there. Because if you feel like you always must know exactly what you're doing when you're out there, you have made the problem so big and so difficult to solve that you'll never get out there. So obviously you want to prepare, right? It's not really that wide open. But expect to do rework. Expect that the data you get will be always larger than the data you use. And that's okay, right? The users' lives are big, coherent elephants. And even if you're only doing an earring, you're going to find out a lot about the elephant. And that's okay.
Kind of a big question, big picture question. When do you move the beacon? Sometimes the initial vision isn't quite right.
I'll talk
You've got to
to you
make
in 10 years
a
about
major
that.
turn. When do you do that in this kind of process?
Well, actually, I won't talk to you in 10 years about that because I did that last week. Not from the point of view of a big move, right? But an adjacency. And that's usually, you know, like the Apple story, that's usually what you're looking for, because I did this in my last company. It is hard for a company to change its business. It can introduce new product lines, it can do new features. It is hard for it to change its business. Even Apple didn't change their business from computers to phones in an instant. They took 15 years, right? 5 years lead up to 10 years from iPhone.org to the actual phone. But, the user data we collected a couple of weeks back said, you know, okay, we are solving this problem here, which is about getting expensive equipment to the people who need it. If we could do it faster, if we could do it overnight, if we could do it in 2 hours, man, would that be a big hit. So that's a big business change, because the logistics are totally different, the inside the company communications to serve that are totally different, our interfaces to our customers are different, I mean our people interfaces as well as our UIs. So it's a whole business decision whether or not we want to go after that. If we do, that'll be an example of moving the flag, right, to an adjacent channel. And then that will have to get built into everything that we do. Okay. All right, thank you very much.